Welcome to episode 7 of Diamine's Music Collection. The composer, Chopin. Swatching on Clairefontaine paper, one can see shades of blue, grey, navy blue, bordering on black. Well, folks, Diamine's Chopin from the Music Collection appears a lot lighter in the bottle than it does on paper when writing. In the swatching, you get beautiful shades of blue and grey. However, when writing, especially with a fine and a medium nib, the color appears closer to black than to blue. This isn't a bright attention-seeking ink. It's almost a formal, almost blue-black ink that keeps its blue character just beneath the surface. Clairefontaine really suits this ink. The smooth-coated paper keeps the lines crisp and sharp, with no feathering and excellent saturation. There's very little shading in the normal writing, which was a disappointment to me, as I really hoped there would be shading in accordance with what was shown in the swatching. Dry times are a little longer, but the result is worth the wait. On Clairefontaine paper, both a fine, medium and broad nib are suitable for this ink. Diamine Chopin on Kakimori paper is where the ink starts to reveal more of its personality. On Clairefontaine, it comes across a little dark, very dark blue that can almost pass for black. On Kakimori, it lightens slightly, and you begin to see more of the blue tone coming through. It's still a serious formal ink, definitely not a cheerful blue sky, but it feels a touch more expressive. Kakimori paper tends to show ink character beautifully, and Chopin responds by displaying a bit more tonal variation. Don't expect dramatic shading, especially in fine and medium nibs, but there is just enough variation to keep the writing from looking flat. The color has a rich inky depth to it. Think midnight blue with a hint of mystery. The edges remain crisp, and the ink sits neatly on the page with no feathering. If you lay down a heavier swab or use a broad wet nib, you may even catch a subtle reddish sheen around the pulled areas. It's not the sort of sheen that jumps up and waves frantically, more like Chopin quietly lifting one eyebrow and reminding you he had a dramatic side. Compared to Clairefontaine, Kakimori gives the ink a little more breathing room. The blue becomes easier to appreciate, and the overall look feels slightly softer and more nuanced. In short, Diamine Chopin on Kakimori is dark, elegant, and just a bit more revealing, like a formal pianist who loosens his tie after the concert and turns out to be far more interesting than you thought. Diamine Chopin on Tomoe River Sanzen paper is where things finally steps into the spotlight. On Clairefontaine, it can look almost black. On Kakimori, you start to see some more of the blue, but on Tomoe River Sanzen, Chopin shows its full character. The first thing you notice is the depth. It's still very dark blue, almost black. But now the color opens up a little. You can see those cool navy undertones that were hiding on more absorbent papers. Even in a fine or medium nib, the ink looks richer and more dimensional. There isn't a great deal of shading, but Tomoe River gives the ink a subtle tonal variation that adds life to the writing. More importantly, if you lay down enough ink, you may notice a delicate reddish sheen along the edges. It's not a loud, look at me kind of sheen. However, on Tomoe River, I found writing with a fine nib to be problematic. The lack of ink flow with a fine nib meant that the nib would scratch into the paper with almost a muddy feel, like you were writing in thick treacle. However, with a medium and a broad nib, the ink on the nib flowed beautifully, and the line weights were consistent, and the line writing was smooth. Diamine Chopin on Rhodia sits somewhere between Clairefontaine and Tomoe River. On a fine or medium nib, Chopin once again borders on black. The blue is there, but it keeps a very, very low profile. You have to look closely or catch it in the right light to see the navy undertones peeking through. There's virtually no shading in everyday writing, which gives this ink a clean, uniform appearance. It looks refined, consistent, and highly professional. In other words, this is the ink equivalent to someone who turns up in a perfectly tailored dark suit and somehow makes everyone else look underdressed. Rhodia's smooth surface gives the edges crisp and well defined, with no feathering and excellent contrast against the page. If you use a broader nib or wetter nib, you may notice a subtle hint of sheen in heavily saturated areas, but in normal writing, the effect is understated. Dry times are moderate, a little slower than on absorbent paper, but generally easier to live with than Tomoe River. Overall, Diamine Chopin on Rhodia feels dark, polished and effortlessly elegant. A blue-black in spirit, even if the label insists it's just a blue. Diamine Chopin on Midori is where the ink feels the most balanced. On Clairefontaine and Rhodia, it can look dark, that is almost passing for black. On Tomoe River, it reveals a little more depth and a hint of sheen. But on Midori, you get a beautiful middle ground. The blue is more visible here, but not as much as I would have liked. It's still a deep, serious navy, but Midori allows enough absorption to soften the ink slightly, so it doesn't look quite as dense or blackened as it does on coated paper. There's still a very little shading in fine and medium nibs, but the color has a touch more warmth and character. It feels less formal and a little more approachable. Think of it as Chopin taking off the tuxedo jacket, but still keeping the bow tie on. Midori also provides excellent edge definition, with no feathering and a pleasantly tactile writing experience. The slight tooth of the paper gives the pen a bit more feedback, which many fountain pen users love. Any sheen is very subtle and usually limited to heavy swabs or wetter nibs. Dry times are generally quicker than on Clairefontaine or Tomoe River, making this combination a practical everyday use. Overall, Diamine Chopin on Midori feels rich, dark, and beautifully controlled. Still unmistakably elegant, just a little less formal and a little bit more human. Diamine Vivaldi is one of those inks that doesn't shout for attention, but once you spend a little time with it, you begin to appreciate just how much character it has. At its heart, Vivaldi is a rich, dusty purple with a distinctly muted tone. It's not a bright, vibrant violet, and it certainly isn't the sort of purple that looks like it belongs in a packet of sweets. This is a more mature color. Think of it as a purple equivalent of a well-tailored velvet suit. There's a subtle grey undertone that keeps the color controlled and sophisticated, giving it almost vintage quality. In some lighting, it appears more plum, while in others it leans towards a soft aubergine. The ink typically shows excellent shading, especially in broader nibs, where you'll see lighter lavender tones transition into deeper, more saturated purple. But to see more, you'll have to watch the next video coming soon. Diamine's Music Collection, Vivaldi. Well, folks, that was episode 7 of Diamine's Music Collection, Chopin. I must say that this ink doesn't try to impress you. The image on the bottle shows a much lighter blue to grey leaning color. And when you write with such ink, you see very little of the blue and more of the grey to black. When you first see it, you might think, right, so it's a dark blue. And that's true in a fine or medium nib. It often borders so closely to black that you could be forgiven for wondering what all the fuss is about. But the longer you spend with it, the more it starts to make sense. This ink is built around subtlety. It's calm, controlled, and incredibly consistent. There's very little shading in everyday writing, and any sheen tends to stay in the background rather than demanding attention. And oddly enough, that's exactly what makes it so appealing. It's the kind of ink you reach for when you want your handwriting to look polished and serious, but not dull. It feels formal without being lifeless, and elegant without trying too hard. What I really like is how it changes depending on the paper. On Clairefontaine and Rhodia, it can look almost black. On Midori and Kakimori, more of that deep navy character begins to show, although subtly. And on Tomoe River Sanzen, you get a glimpse of the ink's more expressive side. So yes, on paper, it may seem understated, but that's the point. In some inks arrive with fireworks. Chopin simply sits down on the piano and plays something so effortlessly and beautiful that you stop talking and listen. And somehow, that quiet confidence makes an even bigger impression. Right, folks, I've waffled long enough on this topic. It is an interesting ink. It is an ink that would be well suited in many collections. And if you found this video interesting and of value, it would mean the world to me if you could like and subscribe to this channel. And if you could share with your friends and family, even better. Until we meet again, this has been another presentation of The Honest Nib. Take care of yourself, look after yourself. Until next time, bye-bye.